The gavel had barely cooled when Judge William Pryor's voice sliced through the air, sharp and abrupt. Jasmine Crockett was mid-sentence, laying out her case with steady conviction when his words cut across hers like steel against glass. The interruption echoed, not just through the four walls of the courtroom, but into the consciousness of everyone watching. It wasn't just procedural, it was a challenge, a dismissal, a statement of dominance. Freeze the frame there. The judge, leaning forward, jaw tight with authority. Crockett, her lips pressed shut mid-thought, eyes steady but blazing beneath the surface. The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to draw oxygen from the room itself. And then comes the narration that no one in the courtroom heard but millions would later feel. What happened next silenced even the judge himself. The atmosphere was electric, tense in a way that only arises when history collides with arrogance. Lawyers shuffled in their seats, spectators leaned in, and somewhere in the back, a clerk's pen stopped mid-scribble. The entire room seemed suspended on the hinge of what Crockett would do next. Would she shrink? Would she concede? Or would she deliver the kind of reply that rewrites the balance of power in an instant? This was more than a legal proceeding. It was theater. It was the clash of authority against authenticity, of entitlement against earned voice. Pryor's tone carried the weight of centuries of institutions that too often silenced women, especially women of color. Crockett's pause wasn't weakness, it was preparation, and the quiet before her answer stretched into a moment of unbearable anticipation. You could almost hear the collective breath of those present, waiting for her response, waiting for the tremor they somehow sensed was coming. Because deep down, everyone in that room knew, this was not a woman who came to bow her head. This was a woman who came to speak truth, even when truth was unwelcome. And when she finally answered, it wasn't loud. It wasn't frantic. It was cold, measured, and devastating. A reply that carried the chill of centuries of silenced voices finally breaking through. But before we get to her cold reply, you need to understand why this moment shook America to its core. Judge William Pryor was no stranger to the art of interruption. In his courtroom, authority wasn't just enforced by the gavel. It was embodied in every clipped sentence, every raised brow, every pointed pause designed to remind litigants that their words lived only by his permission. Over the years, Pryor had built a reputation that conservatives lauded as firm control, but that countless others recognized as something more corrosive, arrogance dressed as discipline. His critics described him as a man who didn't just adjudicate, he dominated, and he relished doing it. That history weighed on the room when he cut Jasmine Crockett short. To those who had followed his career, the move was predictable, almost rehearsed. But what Pryor didn't anticipate was the force of the woman standing before him, because Jasmine Crockett was not the type to play along with a script written for her silence. Her journey into this courtroom was no accident. Crockett had risen through politics and public service with a reputation for speaking truth where others bit their tongues. She carried the weight of lived experience, navigating systems built to exclude, refusing to let those systems define her. For many who had watched her career, she wasn't just a lawyer or a representative. She was a mirror, reflecting the dignity of people who had been overlooked and the fire of those who refused to be erased. And that was what made this interruption so much more than a procedural hiccup. This wasn't just a judge keeping time. It was an old pattern playing out again, a man in power cutting down a woman of color mid-thought, mid-argument, mid-truth. The weight of race and gender hung over the exchange, making the air heavier than any courtroom protocol could explain. Everyone knew what it meant, even if unspoken. In that moment, Pryor represented centuries of systemic silencing, and Crockett stood as the embodiment of resistance to it. The stakes were never just about one case. They were about whether voices like hers could be heard in the very institutions meant to serve justice. For the audience at home, the immigrant worker who had been dismissed in a meeting, the young woman whose ideas were stolen by louder voices, the family member constantly told to wait their turn. This confrontation was personal. Crockett's silence or defiance would echo beyond the courtroom walls into the lived experiences of millions. And this is why the interruption wasn't small, wasn't routine, wasn't trivial. It was an attempt, however subtle, to remind Crockett of her place. But Crockett's entire life had been built on rejecting the place society tried to assign her. That's why the tension was unbearable, why hearts quickened, why viewers leaned closer to their screens. They weren't just watching a trial. They were watching a battle for dignity itself. Because once Crockett fires back, the rules of the courtroom and the power dynamic will never be the same. To understand the weight of Judge William Pryor's interruption, you have to understand the man himself. Pryor wasn't just a judge, he was a towering figure in the conservative legal establishment, a man whose robe seemed stitched not only with authority, but with the conviction that he was untouchable. He carried himself like a gatekeeper of tradition, someone who believed the law was his domain to define, to interpret, to wield like a weapon. His court wasn't just a place of justice, it was his stage, and he was the sole director of every performance. For years, Pryor cultivated a reputation that thrilled conservatives and unsettled progressives. He spoke in the clipped, commanding tones of someone convinced that his word was final. And often, it was. His rulings reflected a philosophy steeped in hierarchy, one that sought to preserve the old order at any cost. He had shown little patience for progressive challenges to entrenched power, and even less tolerance for those who dared confront him directly. But what stood out most was his habit of cutting people off. Witnesses mid-testimony, attorneys mid-argument, even clerks who misstepped. Pryor's interruptions came like hammer strikes. Supporters called it efficiency. Detractors called it arrogance. And time and again, that arrogance seemed to flare most visibly when he faced strong women who refused to bow. There was a pattern to it, a tightening of the jaw, a sharp tone, the air of a man who saw defiance not as courage but as disrespect. It wasn't lost on anyone that these moments often carried an unmistakable undertone. For women of color especially, Pryor's dismissiveness seemed amplified, his condescension sharper. To those watching from the outside, it looked like more than judicial control. It looked like a refusal to allow voices from the margins to carry equal weight in his courtroom. Critics whispered about it. Activists called it out. But Pryor brushed it all aside with the cool assurance of a man convinced that accountability never reached his level. And why wouldn't he believe that? His career had been built on elevation after elevation. His name floated in the same circles as the Federalist Society elites, his rulings praised as the backbone of a conservative judiciary. He wore that aura like armor. Each interruption, each dismissive glance, was part of a persona that had gone unchallenged for years. He wasn't just a judge in his mind. He was the embodiment of the system itself. There were plenty of examples that made his critics bristle. Cases where his opinion seemed to lean not toward empathy but toward order, not toward justice but toward preservation of power. Statements where he dismissed progressive concerns as political theater. Rulings that carried consequences for marginalized communities while being celebrated by right-wing pundits. To him, law was not a living document but a fortress, and he was the gatekeeper who decided who could pass through. That fortress mentality bled into his behavior. He exuded a kind of elitism that wrapped around him like a cloak. He wasn't simply confident, he was condescending. When attorneys tried to assert themselves, Pryor's smirk said more than words. "You're in my house and you will play by my rules." For most, that aura was enough to keep them cautious, deferential, unwilling to press too far. But arrogance has a way of creating its own blind spots. Pryor believed his authority was absolute, his control unshakable. He mistook compliance for respect, silence for agreement. He had grown so accustomed to being the final voice in every room that he failed to see what was coming. Because arrogance, when unchecked, is always a setup for downfall. Pryor's interruption of Jasmine Crockett wasn't unique in his mind. It was just another moment of flexing dominance, another reminder that in his courtroom he set the tempo. But what he didn't recognize was that this time, the person standing before him wasn't just another attorney playing by his unspoken rules. This time, he was up against someone forged in fire, someone who knew exactly what it meant to be dismissed, and who had built her entire career on refusing to let it stand. And yet, he had no idea that the woman before him was not just another attorney to be brushed aside. To understand Jasmine Crockett's reply, you have to travel far beyond that courtroom. You have to trace the road she walked to get there, a road not paved with privilege, but with obstacles she refused to let define her. Crockett's story is one of resilience, of bending under the weight of dismissal yet never breaking, of learning that sometimes the only way to claim your voice is to sharpen it until it cuts through the noise. She grew up in a world that often spoke over her, in classrooms where her answers were second-guessed, in conversations where her ideas were dismissed until repeated by others, in the quiet sting of being told, again and again, to wait her turn. Crockett knew early what so many young women of color learned too soon, that silence is imposed, not chosen, and dignity is defended, not granted. But she didn't just endure these moments. She absorbed them, transformed them into fuel. Education became her battleground. Every assignment completed, every grade earned, was a rebuttal to the voices that doubted her. And when she pursued law, it wasn't out of abstraction. It was out of necessity. She saw firsthand how the law could be twisted into a tool of exclusion, how entire communities were shut out by the very systems meant to protect them. For her, stepping into a courtroom was never just about legal arguments. It was about carrying the weight of those silenced too often. As she rose through the ranks, from attorney to public servant to congresswoman, Crockett cultivated a reputation not of politeness but of principle. She wasn't afraid of confrontation. She embraced it, knowing that confrontation was often the only path to truth. Opponents learned quickly. Jasmine Crockett didn't just debate, she dismantled. She wielded facts like arrows, delivered with a sharpness that left arrogance wobbling on its heels. Yet beneath that fire was always dignity, an insistence that respect was not optional. Her identity was not something she tucked away, it was her power. As a black woman in America, she carried stories written long before her birth, ancestors who fought for a place in democracy, families who labored for opportunities that too often remained just out of reach. And with that came a sense of solidarity that extended outward: immigrant communities, marginalized voices, anyone who had been told they did not belong. Crockett stood for them all. Every word she spoke, every challenge she issued, carried the resonance of shared struggle. And struggle was never absent. Politics tested her at every turn. Colleagues underestimated her. Media critics tried to reduce her to sound bites. Opponents mocked her passion as anger, her fire as unprofessionalism. But Crockett understood the game. When they couldn't counter her arguments, they tried to discredit her presence. And each time she responded the same way, by standing taller, speaking clearer, and refusing to yield. She had been talked over in school, in politics, in countless debates, but each interruption only honed her. Each dismissal only reinforced her resolve. She trained herself not to shrink from the raised voices or the condescending tones, but to meet them with an icy composure that left her opponents floundering. She learned that the greatest weapon against arrogance wasn't rage. It was calm, precise truth delivered with unshakable confidence. That is what made Jasmine Crockett different. She didn't need theatrics to win a room. She didn't need to shout to be heard. Her very presence carried the power of someone who had faced dismissal 1,000 times and learned how to turn it into strength. And for those watching, especially those who knew the sting of being silenced, she wasn't just a politician or an attorney. She was proof. Proof that resilience could rise to the highest levels. Proof that dignity could prevail against institutions designed to erode it. By the time she stood before Judge Pryor, Crockett was already more than an attorney presenting an argument. She was the voice of everyone who had ever been told to sit down, shut up, and accept less. She carried her community, her identity, her solidarity with the marginalized like armor. Every look, every word was a reminder that she belonged, and that no interruption, no matter how forceful, could strip that away. She knew what it meant to be talked over, in school, in politics, in courtrooms. But she had trained her entire life for this moment. She had turned every interruption into a lesson, every dismissal into discipline, every attempt to silence her into a louder declaration of who she was. And so when Pryor leaned forward, his voice slicing across hers, he didn't weaken her. He activated her. And when Pryor tried to silence her, he unknowingly triggered the very strength that defined her career. The courtroom held its breath. Jasmine Crockett was in the middle of a careful, measured argument, each sentence placed like a stone bridge across an old river of injustice, when Judge William Pryor's voice cut in, abrupt as a lightning strike. "Counselor," he said, short, cold, trimming her sentence with surgical precision. Papers rustled. A reporter's pen paused. The rhythm of the room fractured. Crockett's mouth closed for a beat, not out of submission but calculation. She had been interrupted before, in classrooms, in committee rooms, at podiums where polite men decided which voices were permitted to carry. This interruption was familiar, but not acceptable. She turned her attention to Pryor, not with outrage, but with an unblinking calm that tightened the air around them. Pryor's interruption landed like a trained man's assertion of control, measured, rehearsed, practiced in boardrooms and briefings. He leaned forward slightly, the posture of a judge accustomed to being the final voice. His eyes suggested impatience. His tone suggested lesson. The message was clear: do not overstep. For many in the gallery, especially those attuned to history, it read as something deeper, a reflex of an institution that had long policed the cadence of minority voices. Crockett answered not by matching volume but by sharpening intent. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, voice steady, "I believe the record requires me to finish my point." There was no tremor. Instead, there was a precision born of practice, the kind that arrives after being spoken over 1,000 times and choosing, each time, to speak back smarter. Around her, colleagues inhaled as if to steady themselves, and the gallery watched the exchange like a slow, inevitable collision. Pryor's jaw tightened. He attempted a small rebuke, a reminder of decorum, a practiced smile that was meant to deflate challenge. His next words, intended to reassert dominance, came clipped and sharp, but Crockett met them with the exact decorum of the law: facts, timelines, citations. Each phrase slipped past his interruption and lodged in the courtroom like pebbles in a tranquil pond, sending out concentric ripples. Still, the tension escalated. Pryor's interruptions became punctuation marks driven by impatience. Crockett's responses became steel filaments of logic. At one point, Pryor raised his voice, not loudly, but with the controlled authority that people mistake for moral high ground. He wanted to shorten the sentence of the moment, to fold the debate back into his rhythm. Instead, Crockett expanded it. She used the apparent slight as a platform to widen the scope, not just the matter at hand, but the pattern it represented. Her tone remained calm, her words clipped, each syllable a measured strike that exposed the imbalance. The spectators felt it, an old script being rewritten in front of their eyes. Those who had been taught to look away could no longer pretend the scene was merely procedural. Voices in the audience shifted. A lawyer's whisper became a murmur. A clerk glanced up from her notes with something like recognition. In the back, someone dabbed their eyes. On screens and in live streams, viewers leaned closer as comments surged. That tone, that look, that refusal to yield. Social memory was being made in real time. Pryor tried once more to regain the tempo, an admonition, a shake of the head, a suggestion that authority lay in interruption. But his movements, once assured, began to show fissures. A beat too long before speaking, a misplaced intonation, the faint flush of someone unsettled. The room tilted toward Crockett's control without a gavel's assistance. Across the aisles, people shifted. The air crackled with electricity that felt larger than any single case. Cameras tracked each inflection. A juror's hand hovered over a notepad and then stilled. A young activist watching on a phone felt vindication like a physical lift. Court staff who had learned timid politeness found their throats tightening. Crockett's face stayed composed but implacable, the look of someone who had turned private grievance into public strategy. Every word she selected was surgical. Every pause invited Pryor to expose himself further. The judge, for the first time that day, visibly no longer seemed entirely in control. And then, with ice in her voice, she delivered the line that made the courtroom freeze. It came like a blade gliding through velvet, smooth, sharp, undeniable. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't meet Pryor's attempt at domination with volume or theatrics. Instead, she leaned into the silence he had created and spoke with the precision of someone who understood that words, properly placed, could dismantle entire empires. "Your Honor," she began, her voice low and unhurried, "if interruption is the measure of authority in this courtroom, then history has already rendered its judgment, and it was not in favor of silencing truth." The words hung in the air like frost. She hadn't accused, hadn't shouted, hadn't broken protocol. But her tone, measured, glacial, exact, made the entire room feel the weight of centuries pressing through her syllables. It was as if she had invited every silenced voice to sit beside her, and together they spoke through her lips. Pryor blinked once, then again. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a line that threatened but never completed itself. For the first time, he seemed unsure of how to proceed. He had interrupted countless attorneys before, but rarely had one turned the interruption into a scalpel cutting directly at his authority. The silence that followed her words was deafening. A shuffle from the gallery broke it for half a second, followed by the faintest gasp. In the jury box, one pen scratched nervously against paper and then stopped, its writer suddenly aware that no note could capture what had just shifted in the room. Crockett continued, her voice still calm, still cold, but layered with a power that built with every phrase. "I was raised to believe that truth doesn't need permission to be spoken, and if I must finish my point, I will. Not for myself, but for the record, for the people who deserve justice beyond these walls." Her eyes didn't leave the judge. She held his gaze with unflinching steadiness, her pause perfectly timed, not rushed, not hesitant, but deliberate. Every lawyer in the room recognized it, the kind of pause that turns words into weapons, letting their weight fall heavier than any gavel strike. Pryor's body betrayed him. His shoulders stiffened, his hand twitched toward his gavel, then hesitated. He adjusted his glasses though they hadn't slipped, shifted in his chair though he'd sat comfortably all morning. Authority, usually so effortless for him, suddenly seemed like a costume that no longer fit. And the audience felt it. In the gallery, eyes widened, jaws tightened to contain reactions. A current of recognition passed silently between spectators. Some leaned forward, unable to resist the gravitational pull of what they were witnessing. This was not just a courtroom exchange. It was a turning point, a crack in the marble facade of arrogance. For those watching online, the moment became instantly iconic. The clip would later be replayed frame by frame. Pryor's interruption, Crockett's stillness, her words cutting with the finality of truth, the judge's visible falter. But in that instant, before history knew it was history, the room itself seemed to exhale in awe. Crockett pressed forward, each word colder, sharper, and more dignified than the last. "Authority, Your Honor, is not proven by who can speak the loudest. It is proven by who allows truth to be heard, even when it is inconvenient." A murmur ran through the audience like a wave breaking on stone. Whispers darted back and forth, a low current of disbelief mixed with admiration. Someone near the back muttered, "She said it." Another covered their mouth, eyes wide, as if afraid even their breath might shatter the fragile silence holding the room together. And yet Crockett wasn't finished. She let the murmurs swell and then quiet before striking once more. "If my words unsettle, perhaps it is because they reveal what silence has concealed for far too long." The sentence struck harder than a shout ever could. It wasn't just aimed at Pryor. It was aimed at every figure of power who had hidden behind interruption, behind authority, behind the illusion of control. It was aimed at history itself. Pryor's face shifted. The flush of irritation was there, but so was something else. Hesitation, calculation, the creeping recognition that any further attempt to silence her would not restore his authority but annihilate it. For a man who had built his image on dominance, the realization was devastating. Around them, time seemed suspended. Cameras clicked, pens hovered, breaths caught. Crockett had delivered her counterattack not with fire but with ice, an iciness that carried the weight of centuries of defiance. She didn't need to raise her voice because her calm was the loudest sound in the room. Meta-narration. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just an attorney facing down a judge. She was every student who had been told to stay quiet, every worker who had been talked over, every immigrant who had been dismissed, every woman whose voice had been muted by arrogance. She was millions condensed into one figure, refusing to let silence win. And the collective gasps, whispers, and stunned expressions in that courtroom were the proof. People recognized themselves in her reply. The structure of the moment unfolded like a symphony: suspense, shock, and release. First, the unbearable tension of the interruption. Then the shock of her cold, cutting reply. And finally the release, an unspoken, invisible applause that swelled through the courtroom and would later erupt across the nation. No hands clapped, no cheers rang out. It wasn't needed. The admiration was in the silence, in the stunned looks, in the quiet thrill of witnessing dignity triumph in real time. Pryor sat back, visibly unsettled. His gavel stayed untouched. For the first time in memory, he had no interruption ready, no condescension to lean on, no smirk to shield him. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. And Crockett, sensing the shift, simply returned to her argument as though nothing unusual had happened. That was the brilliance of it. She hadn't sought spectacle, she had sought truth. The spectacle created itself. The gallery brimmed with energy. Reporters scribbled furiously, one mouthing to another, "That was history." A law student in the back clutched her notebook to her chest, eyes wet. An older woman seated quietly along the aisle whispered under her breath, "Finally." The ripples were immediate, undeniable, unstoppable. And though the courtroom eventually resumed its rhythm, nothing was the same. Pryor's authority, once absolute, had been punctured. Crockett's reply had redrawn the map of power. The tremor of it would not stop at the courtroom doors. Because what Jasmine Crockett delivered that day wasn't just a cold reply to an interruption. It was a rebalancing of scales, a declaration that dignity could slice through arrogance, that truth could silence even the loudest gavel. But the shockwaves didn't end in that courtroom. They were only beginning. The moment Crockett's words landed, the courtroom felt like a closed circuit charged with electricity. But once the footage hit the outside world, it was as if someone had unleashed a lightning strike into the public square. Within minutes, the clip spread across platforms: Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. A single freeze frame of Crockett's poised face opposite Pryor's stunned silence became the image of the night. Hashtags erupted almost instantly. Crockett clapback, silence shattered, she spoke anyway. Trending across timelines, they weren't just clever phrases, they were battle cries. Users remixed the moment into memes, looping Pryor's faltering blink and pairing it with captions like, "When you realize the old rules don't work anymore." Others slowed down Crockett's reply into cinematic edits, overlaying music that turned her cold words into a crescendo of defiance. Progressive commentators wasted no time seizing the narrative. A popular podcast host called it the courtroom mic drop of the decade. A viral TikTok voiceover declared, "This is what justice looks like when it refuses to be interrupted." Even more striking, journalists who had often tried to stay neutral admitted the obvious. Crockett had taken command in a space designed to strip her of it. One headline blared across news feeds: "Judge silenced by truth itself." Meanwhile, Pryor's carefully cultivated aura of untouchable authority began to crumble in real time. The once feared judge was now being dissected frame by frame, not as a towering figure of law, but as a man visibly rattled, flustered, and overmatched. Social media users clipped his hesitations, his hand twitching toward the gavel, his awkward silence. This is the look of a man who realized interruption won't save him. One viral post read, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. But the true magic of the moment wasn't just in the virality, it was in the way it made people watching from their couches, phones, and lunch breaks feel. For communities used to being silenced, talked over, brushed aside, Crockett's reply felt like a vindication. People wrote in droves. That was for me. A teacher tweeted, "I've been cut off in staff meetings more times than I can count." Today, Crockett spoke for every one of us. An immigrant mother posted a photo of her daughter watching the clip on TV with the caption, "She asked me, can I be like her? And I told her, yes, you already are." The validation rippled outward like waves. Families replayed the clip at dinner tables. Students shared it in group chats with the caption, "Study motivation." Workers forwarded it in Slack channels, half joking but wholly serious that Crockett's dignity under pressure was exactly the inspiration they needed in offices where their voices rarely carried weight. The moment transcended the courtroom. It became a mirror in which millions saw themselves finally winning the argument, finally being heard. Even those who usually rolled their eyes at politics found themselves compelled. One sports commentator with no ties to law or policy tweeted, "I don't know who Jasmine Crockett is, but that's the best defense I've ever seen. Cold, precise, legendary." The clip had crossed the usual boundaries of political discourse and slipped into culture at large, the way rare moments of truth sometimes do. And while Pryor remained silent publicly, his reputation took blow after blow online. Editorials described him as exposed, deflated, stripped of his gavel's power. For a man who had built his image on command, the internet consensus was brutal. He had been outplayed by calm dignity. The memes sealed it, cartoons of Pryor shrinking in his chair, gifs of collapsing towers captioned "Pryor's authority tonight," even mashups pairing his silence with comedic laugh tracks. But amid the humor and the memes, the deeper resonance remained. The people who had cheered Crockett weren't just laughing at Pryor, they were standing taller because of her. The catharsis wasn't in watching a judge falter, but in watching a black woman reclaim the floor with elegance and fire at once. It was a story of dignity breaking through systemic silencing, a reminder that arrogance can be toppled by composure, and that truth has a way of echoing louder than interruption. The shockwaves, then, were both cultural and personal. On the surface, Crockett's words had created a viral sensation, but beneath, they had carved into the hearts of millions a lasting sense of empowerment. She had transformed a courtroom exchange into a symbolic victory that extended far beyond its walls. And yet, what truly mattered wasn't just the viral fame. It was the moral lesson Crockett carved into history that day. What made Crockett's cold reply so unforgettable wasn't simply the sting of her words, it was the clarity they carried. In a courtroom where authority was supposed to sit robed and elevated, she revealed that real authority doesn't come from titles or gavels. It comes from dignity. She reframed the entire confrontation into something bigger than herself, a battle between arrogance and composure, between silencing and truth, between intimidation and justice. In that instant, the courtroom ceased to be just a chamber of law. It became a microcosm of America itself. Every imbalance of power, every attempt to mute a voice that deserved to be heard, every legacy of exclusion was symbolized in Pryor's interruption. And every act of resilience, every refusal to bow, every insistence that justice must be spoken into existence, that was embodied in Crockett's reply. Her strength reminded the country that silence is never neutral. Silence is what systems depend on to continue unchallenged. But a voice, steady, firm, uncompromising, can pierce even the thickest walls of tradition. Crockett's poise, her refusal to be diminished, became a lesson. Arrogance may interrupt, but dignity will always answer. For millions watching, her words transformed into a mantra. Workers in boardrooms whispered to themselves, "Every interruption is an invitation to reply with truth." Students preparing for debates scrawled it into notebooks. Parents told their children that speaking up, even when dismissed, wasn't just bravery, it was necessary. The resonance was not just political, but deeply human. Because Crockett's moment wasn't about one judge or even one courtroom. It was about proving that courage can exist anywhere, in anyone. It was about showing that the measure of strength is not in volume or authority, but in the ability to remain unshaken when someone tries to erase you. She embodied the kind of courage that outlasts titles and offices, the kind that inspires generations to stand taller. And as the echoes of her words continued to ripple outward, they carried with them an unmistakable truth. When dignity speaks, arrogance is forced into silence. When justice rises, intimidation collapses. When identity is embraced without apology, no interruption can stop its power. Crockett in that courtroom became more than a representative or an attorney. She became a symbol. A living reminder that the fight for fairness is not abstract, not distant, but immediate and personal. She stood not just for herself, but for every silenced voice, every cut-off sentence, every moment someone was told to shrink when they were born to rise. And if you thought this was just about one courtroom, think again. Judge William Pryor thought he could interrupt Jasmine Crockett, but her cold reply did more than silence him. It rattled the very walls of his authority. What began as a single interruption became a defining moment, one that left a judge stunned and millions inspired. Crockett didn't just win an exchange. She revealed a truth America too often forgets. Dignity always outlasts arrogance. This wasn't just courtroom drama. It was a reminder that the fight for justice lives in every space where someone tries to silence a voice that deserves to be heard. Crockett showed us that power isn't about who interrupts the loudest. It's about who answers with clarity, with courage, with truth. And now that lesson belongs to all of us. Every time we share her words, every time we stand a little taller in our own lives, we carry forward the spirit of that moment. This channel exists to amplify those voices, to remind you that you are not alone, that resistance is powerful, and that together we write the next chapter of justice. So if you felt the electricity of this moment, if you believe in the strength of voices like Jasmine Crockett's, join us. Subscribe, share this story, and be part of a movement that refuses to be interrupted. Because this isn't just political theater, it's the story of who we are and who we choose to be. And remember, voices like hers are not just defending democracy, they are democracy.